This is Radio 4, and now with Enoch Powell, a career considered. Here's Michael White of The Guardian.
Enoch. The moment I utter the name, you know exactly who I'm talking about. There's only been one Enoch in British public life, John Enoch Powell, known to the family as Jack, until he switched to Enoch in his early 20s, this with characteristic self-confidence to avoid confusion with John Undershell Powell, a fellow classicist some 50 years his senior. Enoch Powell, then, born 1912, died 1998, scholar, soldier, Tory politician and seer. Free-market intellectual, romantic nationalist, fanatical anti-European, unscrupulous racist, all according to taste or judgment. Indisputably best known for this speech, delivered on Saturday the 20th of April 1968 in front of 85 Tory activists at the Midland Hotel in Birmingham.
Those whom the gods wish to destroy, they first make mad. We must be mad. Literally mad as a nation to be permitting the annual inflow of some 50,000 dependents who are for the most part the material of the future growth of the immigrant descended population. It is like watching a nation busily engaged in heaping up its own funeral pyre.
The Rivers of Blood speech, one of the most divisive moments in post-war British history. Yet when Powell died on February the 8th, he got the kind of send-off usually reserved for premiers and princesses. The event led the news bulletins and front pages, remarkable for a man who had last held ministerial office in 1963. But will he be honoured in the British political pantheon, a Burke, a Disraeli or a Churchill? Or is his fate rapidly to become another of those exotic footnotes in the history of a country changed beyond his recognition? The only child of school-teacher parents, Enoch Powell was brought up, as he put it himself, overlooking a railway cutting in Stetchford. Scholarships all the way to Cambridge, and there the ascetic life of the classical scholar as prescribed by his professor and model, A.E. Housman. At 25, Enoch himself was a professor, the youngest in the Commonwealth at Sydney University, until he heard, far away, the beating of a summoning drum.
The most important thing I ever did, and perhaps the only important thing I ever did, was in 1939 when I threw up my position in Australia and came home and joined the army. It was the recognition of something to which I belonged, which had an unlimited claim upon my obedience and upon my allegiance. And that thought has been with me ever since. But of course, what I was fighting for was not so much the United Kingdom as the British Empire. The British Empire seemed to be the great reality. And it was that which resulted in my going into politics. For it seemed to me that the continued existence of that reality depended upon what Parliament decided, and that I must get into politics in Britain if I was going to have any influence or position in the future of the British Empire.
Private Powell, who was to become a brigadier, again the youngest, saw service in North Africa, though not battle, and later fell in love with wartime India. He even daydreamed of becoming its viceroy. But by 1946 he was back in Labour Britain, working in the revived intellectual powerhouse that was the Conservative Research Department. Reggie Maudling and Ian MacLeod, both future Chancellors, shared his room. His future wife, Pamela, became his secretary. Powell set about finding a winnable seat.
He came into Parliament in February 1950 for Wolverhampton South West.
The Daily Mail columnist Simon Heffer is the author of an imminent biography of Powell.
He canvassed in a very military fashion in the constituency. He worked every street. He had card indices, he had ordnance survey maps. He went about it as if he was planning a great military operation. Which, I mean, he'd been a senior staff officer in the war. He'd been in charge of trying to thwart Rommel in North Africa. And he'd had to work out where Rommel's supply lines were coming from and who could intercept them best. And he applied that sort of mentality to canvassing his seat.
The boy from Stetchford railway cuttings turned down a job as a junior minister at the Home Office, from Winston Churchill no less. But in 1955 he accepted a housing post under Eden. He was already marked out as a loner, idiosyncratic and principled in his fashion. A born resigner was Rab Butler's suspicion, and events confirmed that judgment on January the 6th, 1958. Powell, by now Financial Secretary to the Treasury, together with his departmental superiors, Nigel Birch and the Chancellor Peter Thornycroft, quit Harold Macmillan's government over that famous little local difficulty, £50 million of government spending, which the Cabinet refused to cut. To future monetarists, this was the moment when the post-war Keynesian consensus first cracked. Enoch had his credentials then, as an unbending man of principle, but before long he was back in the government as a surprisingly active Minister of Health. In 1963, when Macmillan finally went, Powell and Ian MacLeod refused to serve under the aristocratic Alec Douglas Hume, whom the magic circle of Tory grandees had preferred to the better qualified Butler. Hume duly lost the election, albeit narrowly. Powell and MacLeod, the two refuseniks, shared the blame. Though Powell scored a mere 15 votes to Ted Heath's 150 in the 1965 leadership contest, something called Powellism was already being talked about. John, now Lord Biffin, was an early enthusiast.
What Powellite, to my mind, starts instinctively with the actual personality of the man, and just as so much of de Gaulle is the personality of the man. If you then are looking for a policy which has a thread of continuity about it, I think that he was basically in support of free enterprise, that he was basically in support of a very powerful collective element in society in terms of health and education. I think that he looked to all of that to try and bring about a situation where the nation could run through a free enterprise system rather than through a collective state-controlled system. And that was, if you like, the cornerstone of his kind of domestic nationalism. After that, he was certainly much more concerned to adjust with change, particularly in external change. I don't think of him as arguing a set of beliefs which were going to be permanent and fixed for the lifetime of his career. And I think, in a sense, that found it always rather exciting to travel with him, but also you had to be prepared to be travel sick now and then.
Enoch, once he'd seen which way those winds of change were blowing, had long since jettisoned empire. What now claimed Powell's allegiance were free market economics and nationhood. But Enoch was no stock right-winger. A well-known House of Commons story has Conservative MPs of the small L liberal persuasion reassuring zealous party activists that they'd done the right thing by saying, of course, I voted with Enoch. That needn't have implied anything about monetarism or race relations. It could, for instance, have meant that they'd opposed capital punishment, as Enoch did, or voted in favour of homosexual law reform, or had questioned Britain's nuclear deterrent. Logical nonsense, he called it. In Ted Heath's shadow cabinet as a somewhat anti-American defence spokesman, Powell ranged freely over his colleagues' territory, until, of course, that fatal speech, which incidentally was not cleared first with Party HQ. It also took place just 16 days after the murder of Martin Luther King, the black civil rights leader, in Memphis, Tennessee, an event which triggered urban American riots and projected racial conflict onto the world's front pages. Though only fragments of the speech were recorded by TV cameras, it was an instant sensation. 30 years on, the crudeness of the text still shocks, with its improbable second-hand anecdotes about, quotes, charming, wide-grinning pickaninnies and old ladies. Note that deft use of charming. It proved the turning point of his career. Simon Heffer.
I think the big miscalculation Enoch made about that speech was that he did not believe that Heath could sack him. And he believed that because he was routinely making speeches, and had been ever since Heath became leader of the party in 1965, that challenged the Heathite orthodoxy. What Enoch had not understood was that Heath was petrified by the reaction of what Heath called the heavies, the Times, the Guardian, the Daily Telegraph, to any controversial speech made by a front bencher. And Heath got wind on that Saturday night that the papers were going to take Powell to pieces for what he had done. And with people saying that Powell was a racialist, Heath felt that there was no possible way that he could keep him in the shadow cabinet. However, Heath had isolated Powell within the shadow cabinet for most of the preceding 3 years. And it was quite clear that, again, if one goes and reads the shadow cabinet minutes in the Conservative Party archive, it is quite clear that Heath had been looking for an excuse to get rid of Powell, and Powell provided him with it. It was the big miscalculation of Enoch's career.
The Conservative Party is a tolerant party, it's a moderate party, and it doesn't support extreme views, and it does not support inflammatory language. After all, the more difficult a situation is, the more important it is that people should be reasonable about it.
It was the tone, not the content. He never claimed that the contents were incompatible with the policy of a party. He disliked the tone. It's significant that the word tone was used, and after all, we're talking about a musician.
I remember Ted ringing me up on Sunday morning, because it was all over the Sunday papers, saying Enoch must go. And I said, look, I would just wait and just read the whole speech and just think about it for a few days. No, he must go. Everyone says he must go. And I gathered later there would have been resignations from Shadow Cabinet if Enoch hadn't gone. I thought it was a conclusion jumped to far too rapidly if you looked at the logic and reason in his speech.
In Heath's divided shadow cabinet, Transport spokesman Margaret Thatcher was one of those who proclaimed that, in calling for tighter immigration controls and voluntary assisted repatriation, as well as opposing the Race Relations Bill, Powell was merely expressing Conservative Party policy. This chap, on the other hand, thought he needed a lesson in manners.
I fought an election at North Kensington in 1959 to stop immigration. I didn't get any support then from Mr. Powell or anybody else. And that is the trouble with all these Conservatives. They go to sleep, and then they wake up in a slight hysteria and say rude things and unpleasant things, which in all this long fight I've never said. The stronger, clearer your policies are, the more polite and restrained your language should be.
Yes, you heard that correctly. The former black-shirt leader Oswald Mosley claiming against extensive documentary evidence to have been a stickler for, quotes, polite and restrained language. A calculated restraint was more evident from the Home Secretary and future Prime Minister Jim Callaghan, who quickly deplored the Powell speech.
There's a great deal of support for Mr. Powell's views that is based on ignorance and a lack of knowledge of the facts.
Mr. Heath has said that he's been saddened and grieved by the kind of reaction there has been. Are you pleased to see the Conservative Party reacting in this way?
Yes. I think that Mr. Heath has played a statesmanlike role in this matter. It's in the best interest of the Conservative Party and of the country that he should do so, because the issue of race, which is one of the great issues of the second half of the 20th century, could tear this country apart just as much as the religious struggles did 300 or 400 years ago.
One of those who believed that strong constituency feeling justified Mr. Powell's tactics was the Midlands barrister and Powellite Nicholas Budgeon, who was to succeed Enoch as MP for Wolverhampton South West from 1974 to 97.
I thought it was justified because I thought that, and I still think, that the great danger was that people from comfortable middle-class backgrounds and comfortable upper-class backgrounds who didn't understand the tensions that immigration had caused and was causing simply wanted to avoid the problem. And that was, in my opinion, intellectual cowardice for people like Willie Whitelaw, who were never likely to suffer either in the Borders or in White's Club some of the tensions that people in the back streets of Wolverhampton or Walsall were suffering, to refuse to discuss the issue simply because smart people from The Guardian would immediately say, oh, you're a racist for discussing this issue. And I'm afraid it did seem to me that perhaps rather exaggerated language was necessary in order to highlight the point that there was an issue, and that one of the things that had to be done, no matter how disagreeable, was to engage upon the very strict control on immigration. And indeed, I mean, one of the delights of British public life is its magnificent hypocrisy. And the way the establishment reacted to the Rivers of Blood speech was uniformly to excoriate Enoch, but then to do about half of what he suggested was necessary. And particularly Mr. Callaghan, whose instincts were those of a naval non-commissioned officer, and were probably on almost every issue miles to the right of Enoch Powell, was a magnificent example of the best of British hypocrisy. He, on the one hand, was as rude as possible about Enoch Powell, and on the other hand, set about reducing immigration as hard as he possibly could.
It did not feel quite so jaunty to Paul Boateng. Now a Labour health minister, he was an adolescent in 1968. The speech had an immediate impact on his life.
I was one of those wide-eyed, grinning pickaninnies that he saw fit to quote in a letter, and that was hurtful, of course. For the first time in the country of my birth, and the country of which I'm proud to say I belong, I was shouted at and spat at and abused in the streets, for the first time ever, the day after that.
In 1968, the Jamaican-born sociologist, Professor Stuart Hall, was a young academic working in Birmingham himself. He thinks Powell's expressions of surprise at the outrage sparked by the speech are disingenuous.
It is what I would call an explicitly racialist speech. By that I mean it is driven by the notion that black people are inherently inferior. It doesn't set out to prove that, it assumes that. So all the stories it tells assumes that white people, whether they were under attack or being harassed in the street by black people or not, were quite right to think not only are these different, but they're different and not like us and less civilized than we are, and their very presence legitimates our attitudes. You know, the story he tells in the speech of the woman who's renting rooms, he doesn't say at the beginning that she's the target of any attack. She just doesn't want to rent her rooms to black people. But when she goes to claim rate rebate, and somebody says, well, you have a 7-room house, why don't you rent it? She says, I can't rent it because I can't rent it to Negroes. Well, you know, that is what I would call a speech organized around the notion that these people are inherently inferior. And then when you look at the rhetoric of the speech, you know, the idea that Powell doesn't want to speak but is driven by the situation to speak out, it's a classic rhetorical ploy, you know. I'm not doing this, but I have my duty as a representative of the people to speak about these issues which are being pushed into the background and so on. It's a kind of, you can hear him there negotiating his way across a sort of unspoken taboo or frontier and playing with your willingness to just let him go that much further, that much further, that much further.
Richard Ritchie, who worked as a research assistant to Powell, defends his old boss.
Whatever one may think of Powell's views on immigration, if you define a racist as somebody who believes in the inherent inferiority of one person over another, then Enoch Powell was undoubtedly no racist. And he believed in cultural differences, but he didn't believe in superiority or inferiority.
Urdu and Hindi speaker that he was, Powell's sense of nationhood, however narrowly drawn, was not exclusively a matter of race then, not in the sense widely understood before modern genetic sciences disabused us. It was about culture and cultural homogeneity, which, sometimes at least, he saw threatened more by the strong rival cultures of Asian immigrants than by West Indians.
The distinction between racism based on some biological theory and racism based on a deep sense of cultural difference as so ineradicable that it can't be negotiated, that it's not open to change, that it can't be translated and produce a livable difference over time, that is, I mean, that distinction is a very fine one.
If 1 in 20 throughout the country were an immigrant, I'm not sure that even that could be contemplated with equanimity. But that is not how it will be. There will not be 1 in 20 everywhere, from Penzance to John O'Groats. We have to think not of the total population of the United Kingdom, not even of the total population of England, but of certain areas, towns and cities, where the immigrants and their offspring will overwhelmingly be concentrated. In these areas, the character of the country will have changed beyond recognition. They are not remote corners of these islands. They are its very heart. And by their change, the character of England itself will be changed, and changed in a way which its people neither chose, nor desire, nor ever expected.
That was the People's Enoch developing his theme at the 1968 Conservative Conference. Yet in an interview with the TV presenter Bernard Braden, recorded shortly after the Birmingham speech and never previously broadcast, he had sought to distance himself from the language used that fateful day.
We've had various people in here who are we've had Michael X, we've had a number of people. And they seem to take terribly seriously things like the use of the word nigger, pickaninny, things of that kind. They say, in effect, we find these things offensive. We have found them offensive all our lives. And you must now realize that we are going to say things that are offensive, too. And until we can break through this language barrier.
Yeah, but nothing new. In non-British people saying things offensive about the British. The idea that this is starting now is really ludicrous.
No, except that they have always
the
said
restraint has been on our part.
They have always, in the past, said it as part of a, in their view, as part of a subject race when they were before.
Oh, really? Yes.
This is their feeling. This is their feeling. Now, was the word of the use of the word pickaninny a calculated one? You didn't use it.
It was in a quote.
I see. In other words, you were quoting someone.
I was quoting. And as I was quoting, I felt it right, if I was going to quote at all, to quote verbatim. To alter a word in a quotation really would be a crime. But pickaninny is not in my vocabulary. But it was in the vocabulary of the typical of the person who gave me the typical description that I thought it right to use. Nigger, the word nigger doesn't occur in the speech at all.
The late 60s was a time when Britain's post-war illusions were crumbling fast. The dockers duly marched for Enoch and the political elites panicked. Powell alone received 100,000 letters. He had found a mass blue-collar constituency, ordinary people as he called them. But he persisted in denying racist intent when challenged by Bernard Braden.
In terms of the reaction to the speech, I would guess, from what little experience I've had of post of this kind, that you would find a lot of people lined up on your side from whom you would wish to dissociate yourself, and a lot of people lined up against you that you would be disappointed about.
No.
This wasn't the case.
Fantastically few of the letters I received in support were letters that one would be ashamed to receive. I don't know whether you saw the analysis of 4,000 taken at random, which was made, and with a predetermined definition, before they were looked at, of racialist. And 70 were found which could be brought within that category. Now, the curious thing, actually, is that that number puts it too high, since that figure of 70 included several letters from academics who were racialist in an entirely academic sense, not in an emotive sense, but in an academic sense.
2 years later, Harold Wilson called an election which Labour confidently expected to win. A backbencher Powell kept the immigration theme going through the 1970 campaign.
Christianity and belief in the Christian brotherhood of man has never been held to prevent Christian nations from maintaining their identity. It has not been held to prevent the French or the Germans or the Italians or the Spaniards or any other nation from guarding their frontiers, from controlling the admission and settlement of strangers, so as to preserve the identity of their nation.
Labour was trying to dampen down the race question, but not for the last time. Tony Benn was off message.
The most evil feature of Powell's new conservatism is the hatred it's stirring up, playing on fear and fanning suspicion. The flag of racialism, which has been hoisted in Wolverhampton, is beginning to look like the one that fluttered 25 years ago over Dachau and Belsen.
Powell had loyally campaigned for Heath. Of course, he didn't expect him to win. He expected to supplant him, Simon Heffer.
It was devastating for Enoch when Heath won the election. It was probably the lowest point in his political life because he knew that his chance of leading the Conservative Party depended on Heath's defeat. And although people talked in 1974 about Enoch having written off his chances of leading the party, as far as Enoch was concerned, his chance of leading the Tory party came to an end on June the 19th, 1970, when it was clear that Heath had won the election. Having said that, if you look at I think there were 9 campaign speeches that Powell made during the 70 election, there is not a word in any of them that can be interpreted as an incitement not to vote Conservative. Powell made it very clear that the choice at that election was between the Free Society and the Socialist State, and he urged people not to vote for the Socialist State. And it was precisely because in 1970, and this is 3 months after Selsdon, precisely because he went around the country in May and June 1970 saying to the electors, my party now believes in free enterprise. It believes in the market economy. It believes in a lower involvement of the state in the lives of individuals, that he felt so deeply betrayed 2 years later when Heath did the U-turn and started to control prices and incomes and did many other things which were not in the 1970 manifesto.
Faced with rising unemployment, social unrest and the collapse of the post-war world of fixed currencies, Heath retreated from his free market model from Selsdon Man. In the United States, so did Richard Nixon. As with Powell's Treasury resignation in 1958, this was, for the Powellites, another critical turning point.
Inflation is caused by one thing and one thing only. It is caused by our own government who insist on spending more but taxing less, and are then obliged to fill the gap which opens by creating extra money.
He was, of course, the very first person to realize that inflation had nothing to do with prices and incomes. It was to do with the money supply. And if you put the money supply up, then up would go the prices and incomes. But it was the money supply, therefore the interest rate, you had to look at. And he was the first person to realize that.
When Heath called the Who Governs Britain election of February 1974, neither immigration nor monetarism was the prime issue. The miners were on strike, there was a 3-day working week, but most important, Britain had joined the then European Common Market. Powell had once favoured the Common Market when it was only going to be a free trade body. By now he had decided it meant Parliament was no longer sovereign. He could therefore not stand as a candidate.
This is the first and last election at which the British people can be sure of the opportunity to decide whether their country is to remain a democratic nation, governed by the will of its own electorate, expressed in its own parliament, or whether it will become one province in a new European super-state under institutions which know nothing of the political rights and liberties that we have so long taken for granted. 18 months ago, at the Paris Summit Conference, this country was committed by the Prime Minister to economic and monetary union by 1980 with the rest of the European Economic Community. That means that so far as this Conservative government is concerned, the lifetime of the next Parliament will see the governance of Britain throughout the whole range of monetary and economic affairs transferred from Whitehall and Westminster to European authorities whose decisions will take uniform effect throughout the territory of the present 9 member states. It is for me supremely that kind of question on which, if there be a conflict between the call of country and the call of party, the call of country must come first.
In other words, vote Labour. Powell no longer hoped for the Tory leadership, but yet again he had miscalculated. Against expectation, Heath lost. Indeed, Labour also kept us in Europe. It did not stop him, relishing his rival's discomfort. Years later, he remembered it.
Having been up late the previous night, I tiptoed down and saw the newspaper slanting through the letterbox. Heath's gamble fails. I pulled it through and it fell open. And I retired to the bathroom and sang the Te Deum. I had had my revenge on the man who had destroyed the self-government of the United Kingdom. I put him in and I took him out.
There could be no comeback now, or could there? To the surprise of many admirers, Enoch Powell accepted an offer from the Ulster Unionists of South Down to be their candidate. Yet again, he placed himself at the cutting edge of a conflict over national identity and communal tension far more lethal than in the back streets of Wolverhampton. Powell's solution for Ulster: full integration with the UK.
Once Ulster politics, by becoming part of the total politics of the United Kingdom, ceases to be parochial, once it ceases, because it is Ulster politics, to be solely about what is called the border, then the Roman Catholic in Northern Ireland is in the same position as his fellow Roman Catholic citizen in Great Britain.
The central thing about Enoch was his belief in the nation-state, and in that a majority of people in the 6 counties wished to remain a part of the nation-state. He was going to support them in their cause because it was a cause that he believed in. He also told me that one of his great political achievements, perhaps in many regards his greatest political achievement as he saw it, was to have the representation of Ulster in Parliament increased from 12 to 17 seats after 1979, which he could not have got out of the Labour government had the Ulster Unionists not, as it were, held the balance of power for so much of that last couple of years before the 79 election.
That influence over a Labour minority government was to fade rapidly when Margaret Thatcher won a clear mandate for neo-Powellism in 1979 and consolidated it after her extraordinary military adventure to recapture the Falklands in 1982. Powell wished her well in his own distinctive way.
The Right Honourable Lady the Prime Minister, shortly after she came into office, received a sobriquet as the Iron Lady. It arose in the context of remarks which she made about our defence against the Soviet Union and its allies, but there was no reason to suppose that the Right Honourable Lady did not welcome and indeed take pride in that description. In the next week or two, this House, the nation, and the Right Honourable Lady herself will learn of what metal she is made.
The scepticism so evident there characterises his disdain for all Tory leaders since Churchill. In wartime intelligence, Powell had studied Field Marshal Rommel's writings and found them banal. Brilliant action, it seemed, did not always require a brilliant intellect like his own. So it would be with Thatcher, an inferior mind, but much the better politician. They duly clashed over the Anglo-Irish agreement.
Does the Right Honourable Lady understand? If she does not yet understand, she soon will. That the penalty for treachery is to fall into public contempt.
Mr. Speaker, I think the Right Honourable Gentleman will also understand that I find his remarks deeply offensive.
That's a good point on which to stop and ask what exactly his 37 years in Parliament did achieve. Northern Ireland, for example. 12 years after he upbraided Margaret Thatcher, Anglo-Irish ambitions for a political settlement are even further away from Enoch Powell's mystical notions of self-reliant British identity. American interference, against which he constantly railed, is more obvious than ever in the peace process. Even closer to home, Scotland and Wales are restless. What price Powell's England, the England of small country churches? Richard Ritchie again.
He used to talk about England a great deal. Many of his sort of most memorable speeches are on the subject of the special place of England and essentially the continuity of its institutions and the fact that so much changed outside but a sort of unbroken thread. I think this is what he essentially believed the fundamental belief of a conservative was this, the unbroken history and the continuity which he constantly went back to when talking about nationhood or anything else.
No, didn't quote Burke much, did he?
He didn't quote Burke very much, no. I suppose he felt he was better than Burke.
The continuity of a nation is very closely connected with people's memory. Folk memory, I think, may be the technical term for it. And the fact that there are memories in all the nooks and crannies of Westminster Abbey does not render Westminster Abbey obsolete. It does not render it any the less an expression of being English and standing where Parliament and the Abbey stand. One is standing, corny though the expression may be, very close to the heart of England.
For the moment, such sentiments seem gloriously irrelevant. Indeed, the same can be said of much of the agenda he pursued with such passion. Integration of Britain's post-war Commonwealth immigrants into the mainstream of national life has justified more optimistic scenarios than Powell's foaming River Tiber. Stuart Hall.
It is a very pre-democratic, feudal conception of the national order, very hierarchical. And I think this suits the temperament in the sense that I think Powell's temperament was a temperament which was, highly original in intellectual terms and very intelligent, but a mind which was essentially, I would say, rigid, a mind drawn to the traditional, to the archaic, to that which can be preserved from the past. In that sense, he's a profound conservative. A pre-capitalist, pre-modern kind of conservative. And therefore, the notions of closed cultures and sovereign nations and strong peoples, this litany, connect with one another. And I think we can see certainly the latter part of his career as very much driven by these idioms.
What's wrong with racism? Racism is the basis of nationality. Nations are, upon the whole, united by identity with one another, the self-identification of their citizens, and that's normally due to similarities which we regard as racial similarities.
In 1998, not only is vibrant multiculturalism the prevailing orthodoxy of cool Britannia, it is orchestrated by a Labour government with a huge Commons majority, one which is devolving power away from his beloved Westminster in all directions. It is edging towards acceptance of the European single currency, this on the un-Powellite grounds that it is a merely economic arrangement, not the stuff of nationhood. Is Enoch then the irrelevant footnote? Is he proof of his own judgment about Joe Chamberlain, the last West Midlands politician to bewitch the nation 100 years ago? Chamberlain, of whom Powell wrote that all political careers end in failure. Not necessarily, and certainly not yet. For one thing, New Labour embraces many of the free market assumptions pioneered by economic Powellism. Politicians can make huge mistakes. Powell certainly did so in that decade up to 1970, when his ambitions soared as a man of destiny. But getting one big thing right can redeem a sullied reputation. Churchill's career shows that. A race in the 1960s is the indelible stain on Enoch Powell's record. His friend Ian MacLeod once said that while he enjoyed travelling with Enoch, it was wise to get off the train of his logic a couple of stops before it hit the buffers. That is true of so much of what Enoch, the provincial romantic, Enoch, the perpetual outsider, said and did. But the tone and manner of his campaign on race and immigration stand apart. They can only be ascribed to the pull of ambition, creating both adulation and fear. Once thwarted, he reverted to type, the intellectual in politics, on tap, not on top. Indeed, the Labour economist Lord Desai, no Powellite, detects another lasting impact on his notoriously pragmatic party.
Powell was unusual in that as a politician on the right, he was more bookish than was fashionable. You had Crossland and people like that on the left who were bookish and proud of it. But on the right, it was not thought to be good to be bookish. And he started a whole trend of right-wing intellectuals. He laid the foundations of serious thinking on the right in the post-war period. The idea that policies, government policies, should come from serious thinking and not from muddling through. Yes, he is the father of think tanks.
Economic fashion may already be shifting away from markets, but Enoch Powell's standing with posterity will in any case depend on how our post-imperial identity crisis, cultural and political, is finally resolved on these islands, whether inside that European superstate he's so deplored or outside it, inside a united kingdom or a disunited one. Simon Heffer still thinks the tide is moving Powell's way.
Well, Emmett Gordon-Brown is now following an economic policy which Powell was urging on Harold Macmillan in 1957. It is clearly a great triumph for Enoch that the economic policy being followed at the moment, is a Powellite policy. You can say that he lost on Europe, but I don't hear that the final whistle's been blown yet on Europe. There is still going to be the mother of all battles about Europe when we go into a single currency. Yes, in sheer terms, he did not succeed in his opposition to the 1972 European Communities Act. But that fight is not yet over. And the fact that the Conservative Party, or what is left of it, has elected someone who pretends to be a Eurosceptic as its leader and does appear to have moved away from the, broadly speaking, Euro-friendly policies of the last government, would seem to suggest that Powell's influence among Conservative thinkers and Conservative voters is very strong on the European question. Again, on the question of nationhood, yes, the SNP have had a great victory by making the Labour Party have a referendum in Scotland on devolution, and the Welsh have voted by a narrow margin to have an assembly. But again, these are largely, I think, experimental junctures. Who's to say there won't be another 1707? Who's to say that, when the SNP have governed Scotland for 10 years in the teeth of Labour Party opposition, that there won't be a movement in Scotland to actually reform the Union? And these questions are never actually resolved. You can't say that Powell lost on Europe or he lost on the nation-state. I think also, Powell was, although he was a great British nationalist, and that was the root of his belief in the Union, the root of his, conviction about serving as an Ulster Member of Parliament, he was, above all, an English nationalist as well. And Powell would say, OK, if the Scots and the Welsh and the Irish eventually choose, as the Welsh and the Scots are on the way to doing so, to go their own way, then the English nation has always been here, and it will still be here at the end of the day.
What about race integration? Did he, towards the end of his life, look around, wonder whether the apocalyptic fears which people voiced to him as constituents and he articulated for them had been misplaced, or is the final whistle not blown on that either?
The final whistle is not blown on race either, no. Powell always quoted figures from the first 4 or 5 years, or projections from the first 4 or 5 years of the next century. He said, at a time when it was predicted that the population of this country would be 70 million, which of course it was a great overestimate, he said there would be between 5 and 7 million people from the new Commonwealth in this country. The Runnymede Trust's latest figures for in between the two censuses, 1991-2001, were that there were about 3.6 million people. Now, that population is growing very rapidly because it is a predominantly young population and it is reproducing, as predominantly young populations do. And I think by the time 2002 comes, which is the year that Powell often used to cite, we are going to be very close to his prediction as a proportion of the real population. Whether that translates into civil strife, we saw civil strife in the 1980s. We saw Broadwater Farm, Brixton, Toxteth, St Paul's, Bristol, Handsworth. There were a series of riots which were largely racial in motivation. It was seen to be a white police force attacking or being attacked by a black underclass. Powell, I know, certainly died believing that his predictions would still come true, that there would one day, because of the ghettoization of the black population in this country, because of its large numbers, there would be a fracture within the nation, which he occasionally referred to as being a civil war.
So there it is. Prophet or pariah? We shall see. As so often in history, it will all depend on what happened next.
Enoch Powell, A Career Considered, was presented by Michael White, the political editor of The Guardian. The producer was Dennis Sewell. This is BBC Radio 4. It's 8:05. And now a tale of treachery in the South Pacific. Dee Burkett looks behind the legend of a famous mutiny